having Timon McPhearson with us today. Some of you may not know, but the Urban Systems Lab, which is the research facility that Timon leads in the New School in New York City, is the place where I spent 4 years working before coming here. So to me, it's very exciting to see these two worlds finally collide. And I'm very excited for whatever comes out of this. Yeah, Timon McPhearson is director of the Urban Systems Lab in New York City. He's also leading author of the IPCC, the Urban Chapter. He is also a research fellow at Stockholm Resilience Center and at the Carey Institute for Ecosystem Studies. Yeah, those are formalities that I've never quite sympathized with, but I will say that Maria and I suggested a topic to Timon, which is as overarching and integrating as possible of many things: data science, co-production, the social side of how to participate as a researcher in the urban climate change adaptation. But there are many things that are not going to be covered here today, such as Timon's contributions to nature-based solutions mainstreaming worldwide as a co-PI of the Natura and nature-based solutions in their Anthropocene project, and also his background as an applied ecologist. So some of those that might be here out of curiosity are working in the terrestrial ecosystems line and are interested in exploring applications of urban ecology or classical ecology in urban landscapes. Maybe it's worth just flagging this brain that we're going to have with us today. So Timon, take it away, and thank you all for coming down.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for giving me a chance to talk to you. Thank you, Pablo and Maria, for inviting me, and for Christina, who maybe is not here, but who was helping organize and get me here as well. It's great to, as you said, have the worlds come together a little bit. I've been following work from BC3 for a very long time, so hopefully some of you will have a chance to talk with a little bit further this afternoon. I'll be here and around all day and this evening. As Pablo mentioned, I prepared a talk based on what you told me to do, which is to try to cover a range of things. So there's a lot of different pieces, but the piece I'm focusing on is some of the work we've been doing since 2015 on co-producing science with stakeholders of various kinds, from community groups to government officials, and using that as a way to start to think about how we can envision more resilient and adaptive futures. I work on cities, so there's a very strong focus on the urban here. But I'll just get started, and you'll kind of see where I'm going. Let me just make sure things are working.
Do you need to click on it?
Maybe you need to click on it. Right. Now let's see if now it's working. So as Pablo mentioned, I founded the Urban Systems Lab, which is a research center inside the New School, which is a university in downtown Manhattan in New York City, where I've been since 2008. I was at Columbia University before that and other places. One of the advantages of the New School is they're very promoting of interdisciplinary work. And I see some of the challenges that cities face as one that requires interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary solutions. The goal of the lab is really to bring the design community and the social science and biophysical science communities together as a way of proposing solutions to address urban environmental challenges. But we take urban very broadly in that sense. The other piece I want to mention is why systems? Why do we call it the Urban Systems Lab? Well, a key piece of this work is really trying to advance a new urban science. And there have been calls for this since some of the work we did in 2016 leading up to UN Habitat 3 and the formation of a lot of works around the rights to the city is really thinking about the systemic nature of problems, the kinds of challenges that cities and urban regions face, and the nature of and need for systemic solutions, ones that really take systems approaches. So a couple decades of work on socio-ecological systems, on social technical systems, and STS science broadly. Our goal is really to try to unite that into a broader umbrella of interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary work that has systems approaches at its core. So this is something we've been calling SETS, socio-ecological technological systems. Again, it's explicitly bringing technology and infrastructure into SES and vice versa, the ecological side that's often been missing in a lot of STS studies. Even though they may claim, if you really look at the literature, and I'll just say this very strongly, maybe too strongly, is that the SES community will say that it has always included technology and infrastructure, but if you look at the work, it really hasn't. And so our goal here is to actually create an umbrella that can really start to advance a new kind of urban science. And there's a lot of other people working on this, so this isn't just me, of course. So SETS has been published in lots of places. I first started working on the SETS conceptual framework that now has become a theoretical underpinning of everything we do in the lab, but also with a lot of our collaborations. In 2014, this was part of the first Society for Urban Ecology meeting, a group called SURE that happened in Berlin in 2014. And out of that grew the first paper that we published in Bioscience on the SETS framework, and it's kind of grown from there. And it's now kind of spreading around. There's a lot of other things. I won't say much more about it other than that this underpins a lot of the work that I do. And it's just a core foundation where we're trying to use that as a way to make sure that for any of the work that we're doing, that we're bringing planners, social scientists of various kinds, economists, anthropologists, but also climate scientists, ecologists, and engineers around the table together to imagine what innovative solutions might look like for urban challenges. The other major driver of my work and of the work of the Urban Systems Lab is sort of the recognition that we now live in the what some have called the urban century. It's the rise of cities we've been seeing for the last 200 years, but now it's come to really dominate and drive major environmental changes. So these are somewhat coincidental in a sense, but we also have a fundamental hypothesis that the great acceleration on the planet is actually an urban acceleration driven by urban change. And that colliding of urbanization and climate change and biodiversity loss is one that has to have cities as part of the solution, and not simply as an impact. And so you can see also that some of the kinds of impacts that can be ascribed to urban consumption, urban growth on the planet. So again, that's what we see as a fundamental challenge. And all of the work that I work on and as part of the Urban Systems Lab is work that is trying to move away from a dystopian future that tends to dominate the way in which we get through media or through scientific scenarios that say the future looks pretty dire. We get this out of the climate reports from IPCC. We get it through science fiction that tends to be very dystopian. Our question is, what are the kinds of pathways that we can develop to move towards more positive futures? And the underlying hypothesis here is we're never going to get to a more positive future if we can't imagine it. And so that's why I want to talk about how we co-produce these imaginaries and some of these scenarios, because we have to start with actually articulating what we want and then think about how we can work from the present to the future to get there. And again, a core value that we have is that we're going to have to be doing it simultaneously across transformation in social systems, ecological systems, and technological and infrastructure systems. Piecemeal approaches are going to have too many trade-offs, and we're going to have to think about it systemically. Paulo said I wasn't going to talk about this, and I'm not, but I'm going to mention it for later, is that I do think there's a really important role for ecosystem-based approaches and nature-based approaches, and it's a major focus of my work, but I'm not going to talk about it much today. But I just mentioned that the largest global network of Network, Natura, we founded in 2019. I co-lead this with my colleague, Nancy Grimm. It has a lot of other global networks that you might be familiar with as part of this network. And we're doing a lot of interesting work. So if you want to know more, check out Natura-net. There's working groups across a whole range of different topics that are producing new science. And one thing you can look out for next year, I don't know how soon this will come out, you know how publishing works, but we have a special feature in the journal PNAS on urban nature-based solutions called Nature-Based Solutions for Urban Sustainability. There's 8 to 10 papers, they're all in process, and that will come out as a special feature in PNAS that Nancy and I are co-editing sometime, I don't know, let's say next summer, something like that. This should be out. Another key outgrowth of this, 2 pieces here. One is a fully new open access volume with the majority of chapters led by women, very strong global South presence, over 60 authors on the state of the science in nature-based solutions that we just released in August. Again, it's free, open access online that my colleagues Nadia Kavish and Nikki Franciscaki and I put together. And another related outcome from this also is work that's happening in my part of the world in the United States, which is an outcome of the work I've done for the IPCC, which I'll mention a little bit in a minute, but also some of the input into this book is informing policy in the United States. So last year, just for a little US narrative here, the Biden administration released its first ever executive order on nature-based solutions. So that came out in the spring of 2022. That was a result of a briefing that I did, and like most policy, a policy window that opened because of this administration to be able to take some real action on that. So we just launched last week the call for authors for the first national nature assessment ever in the United States that should mirror the national climate assessment that just came out 2 weeks ago, the fifth assessment from there. So there's a lot of really interesting work around the mainstreaming of nature-based approaches for climate resilience. And that work by the Biden administration is focused on nature-based solutions for climate adaptation mitigation. So it's very much interwoven with the climate strategies of the current administration. I'm going to skip that. So now I'll start the main part of the talk, which this is BC3. I don't need to tell you anything about climate change. But I do want to mention just a couple quick facts around the urban component that motivate the work that I'm going to share with you around co-production of future visions and strategies. One is one of the most sobering impacts of this, and I worked on the working group 2, as Pablo said, a lead author for the urban adaptation chapter, chapter 6, and some other chapters. And a key finding here that for me is sort of underlines the urgency of the problem is that the next 20 to 30 years of climate change are already built into the climate system. So when we see all these examples of climate extreme events or weather-related extreme events that are impacting cities, as well as agricultural areas, forested areas, other places around the world, we're seeing them accelerate. What the IPCC said, among many things that it said in its last reports that came out last year, is that the next 20 to 30 years of that acceleration is already built in. So it just underlines the need for rapid, deep decarbonization. But in the work that I do, which isn't really focused on mitigation, I'll be honest, it's primarily focused on adaptation and resilience. That for me, it underlines the need to be shifting towards that adaptation, that adapted future as fast as possible, because it looks like we're going to be seeing much more acceleration of impacts over the next couple of decades. And that's with sort of best case scenarios around the energy transition and decarbonization and other things. Another thing that came out, and we released this at COP27 last year, is what we call the summary for urban policymakers. So a subset of what the IPCC produced, we pulled across all 3 working groups, a summary for the urban policymakers, and there's 3 reports that were released last year, actually earlier this spring, I guess. And so the SUP, as we call it, there's 2 points I want to make from that before I sort of dive into some of the actual case studies. The first, again, this is kind of motivating why urban. The summary for urban policymakers, again, pulling from the IPCC reports, really emphasize that the impacts of climate change will be very strongly felt, if not mostly felt, in urban environments because cities concentrate people, they concentrate infrastructure, and they concentrate economies. So when you look at an economic impact of climate extreme events over the last year, or you look at the number of people who've been displaced, those numbers are largely going to be driven by urban populations, by urban infrastructure, by urban economies. So again, it really underlines the need for thinking about a transition and a rapid transformation for adapting cities and urbanized regions for these kinds of impacts. The second point and last point on this I wanted to make also is that there's both a realization that it's complex and maybe more complex than we thought, as well as a need for new data. There's a lot of gaps around this. This conversation actually was just happening also yesterday because some of you who are paying attention to the AR7, the 7th assessment cycle of the IPCC, will know that the first report of AR7 will be a special report on climate change in cities. So that scoping process is happening. Yesterday, a group from the Summary for Urban Policymakers met to already start putting input into the structure of that process, including with some of the working group co-chairs. And one of the major points that came out of yesterday's meeting was what we emphasized within the Summary for Urban Policymakers, which is that the impacts are becoming much more systemic, simultaneous. We're seeing more cascading and compound impacts, and yet we still don't know very much about those. So there's a major research gap that I would just say is a motivation that's coming out of this major global assessment work, that we need to better understand the nature of cascading and compound and simultaneous impacts. And we need to also then, if we can understand them better, think about what solutions to those kinds of very integrated, interrelational, and interacting impacts are. And again, the nature of the complexity of urban environments makes that both hard to understand, but also a place that's of priority. So here's what I want to talk about, again, based on your prompts, to talk a little bit more about co-producing this with diverse types of stakeholders. 3 projects, and then a final one of climate IQ, which is a little bit different, but I'll explain why. The first is the Urban Resilience to Extremes work on co-production of future visions. This is a project started in 2015, and I'll say some more. And then, like the talk title suggests, I want to drill down to New York City and tell you a little bit about things that are happening in New York in the last couple of years and now. And then end with what it might mean to think about scaling out these kinds of approaches. So I'm going to dive in. UREX, as we call it, which I think is a terrible name, but is somehow stuck, and we've never been able to get away with it. But it stands for Urban Resilience to Weather-Related Extremes Sustainability Research Network, or urexsrn.net, if you want to check it out. Yeah, the website's at the bottom. This was funded by a $12 million grant from the U.S. National Science Foundation. There's a whole range of colleagues. I'm not forgetting, I think it was 20 academic institutions, over 100 researchers, and over 400 practitioners, all part of this network. One of the major activities of that was countering the dystopian narratives of our future by co-producing future visions with city stakeholders in 10 different cities. So here's the list of cities we worked in the US and Latin America. And I'm gonna just kind of talk through what that process was like, what we learned from that, and give you a little bit of example of what that co-production process might mean, also in terms of the impacts that we've had. So drilling down in really kind of quickly, this is an overview of what that process was, an iteration of multiple workshops, bringing together generally around 45 to 55 stakeholders that we break into small groups. And those stakeholders would include local activists, community organizations, city agencies, but also state and federal agencies, and bringing them together in the same place, and then asking them to think about what a positive, resilient, adapted future would mean for them. You can imagine these are often contested conversations. Not everyone agrees on what that might look like. So the very first part of that, of even scoping and framing such a workshop, includes professionally training facilitators to run some of those workshops around the table, developing pre-surveys to really come up with core themes that we've done with those stakeholders once we've produced a list of stakeholders in each of those cities, working with local groups who had relationships in place, then going actually into full day, long day workshop settings with those stakeholders where they've committed time to sitting around and really kind of dealing seriously with this, where we define overarching goals, use those goals to then develop specific strategies. How would we address the core climate challenges that they're facing? Moving then into adding much more detail and getting specific around going from goals to strategies to specific targets. Where would they happen in place? Where would they happen in time? If you think about this towards the end of the century, and this was all framed around 2100, if we want to achieve a resilient Phoenix, Arizona, or resilient New York City, or Valdivia, Chile, what might that look like in 2100? And what are we going to need to do now and in 10 years and in 20 years to get there? So I'll show you a little bit more of this. This is just the overview of what that overall process looks like, including going from qualitative information that's produced sitting around the table, drawing maps, doing timelines, verbalizing, taking notes, doing actor narratives where people are even acting out that future and coming up with sort of imaginaries around that, and then bringing that into a quantitative environment where we can model that out and compare and contrast it in a quantitative way. So I'll kind of walk you through a little bit of it. One of the, I think, most important features of the UREX scenario work is that we really focused, and this was something we had to push on a little bit in these workshop settings, was to think like fundamentally transformatively. And what I mean by that is it's very easy to say, well, we need, a little more trees, and it would be nice if we had, cleaner water, et cetera. Like if we can imagine 80 years from now, so I guess now it's 76 years from now, if we can imagine that long of a time and really think about that future, how can we use that time to get out of what we often describe as the tyranny of the present, meaning a lot of the low-income communities, immigrant communities, minority communities that we were working with in most of these cities are worried about food security, energy security, economic security, right? Paycheck month to month to month, sometimes week to week. So it's very hard for them to imagine, truly imagine what an entire city might look like if it was resilient to climate change in the future. So using that long-term time frame of 2100 gave us the ability to create a space that most of them have never been able to be in before, which is a place where they could kind of leave the present behind and focus on that future. And in doing so, start to really be creative about what that might look like. And one of the pieces that we pushed on was, if we're going to be creative, let's be ambitious. What could we really imagine? And then again, thinking about how we work from that articulated future using backcasting approaches and others to work backwards to the present, to start to think about what has to happen in the next 5 years and 10 years to do that. Here's a couple examples of some of the overarching goals for in San Juan, Puerto Rico. Some articulations around a particular scenario around a livable and a just city. This was one scenario among 6 scenarios that were produced there. And some of the goals they had was they wanted to make sure that there was equitable access to social, technological, and environmental services. So thinking about equity as a fundamental right to all the services that might be provided in San Juan. Thinking about how you might develop a culture of participation, and then strategies around that they came up with, again, sort of bottom up process here of how they would want to focus on and develop a strategy around decentralization of how resources are managed, thinking about collective economies and collective decision making, going from things that we have shown can be successful, like participatory budgeting, but now taking that kind of approach and moving that through all types of governance. Right? Not easy to do. Maybe you might even imagine they're impossible to do, and they are impossible in the present. But the idea here is that it doesn't have to be impossible in the future if we can figure out what that looks like and then work backwards to start now. In Harlem, in New York City, where we focused, that was a focus workshop in Harlem, working with the Harlem community there and some community organizations that are recognized leaders in that space. Some of their goals were really about dealing with some immediate impacts of flooding. So they're concerned about the combined sewer and stormwater systems, about the inequities of who's actually being impacted by flooding. So addressing those inequitable impacts of flood risk. And then thinking about the fact that New York City is doing a lot of coastal development. It's still very much a development city, right? And what does that mean in terms of ways we might want to curb that when you think to a future where New York City is going to be a lot wetter? And we know it is. The seas are rising. It's just the nature of what New York City 2100 is likely to be. So how do we come to terms with that, but also bringing equity and justice principles in? And so they went from goals to very particular strategies, like increasing permeability, developing incentives for retrofitting buildings and homes, and thinking about what those economic incentives might look like for reducing impacts of flooding. And I'll show you some more particular examples of that in just a second. I'm still kind of giving you the overview of how this whole process works. So this is kind of the long example. All the rest of them are shorter, just to kind of dive in a little bit. So I mentioned adding detail. So first, sort of overarching goals, moving those goals into very specific targets, and then going, into strategies, and moving the strategies into very particular targets. Where in Harlem here, for example, drawing on the map where they think particular innovations need to be placed. Where does new community centers need to be invested in? Where are new tree planting, other things for adapting to heat? Where are the particular places that they know are hot or they know are highly areas of high concentration of air pollution that need to be redeveloped or retrofitted, and having them get very specific about it from a spatial perspective. Up here, you can see an example where there's a big, giant piece of paper, which is a timeline. What needs to happen in 2020, in 2040, in 2060 in order to achieve those very high level and ambitious goals, transformative goals for 2100. And then we also hired artists to work with us to start to illustrate what that future might look like. And there's a lot of other kind of interesting and fun things we did, because we want this process to be fun and creative as a way of stimulating good ideas. Then once we had all of that very rich information, we then coded all of that qualitative information, turned it into a giant matrix, and then used that matrix to create rules in a machine learning environment that can forecast out how land use and land cover would need to change in order to be that future in 2100. And we can run those at many time steps and then look back in time to see what kind of changes might need to happen and how much they might match or not match the timelines that were produced. So you can see here for San Juan, Puerto Rico, above you've got this detailed timeline. In the middle, this very specific mapping where you can create specific places where things need to change in the landscape. And then here is a 2100 land use projection map based on the rules that came out of that stakeholder setting that were produced by the stakeholders. And then we tipped those back to the stakeholders and said, does this make sense? Is this where you meant that you want to do local mangrove restoration and wetland restoration for coastal protection? Is this what you meant in the locations that you want to invest in urban agriculture for food and security? Why do we do that? Well, we wanted to be able to compare different scenarios. So fundamental idea of all of this work is that there's no one vision and there's no one future, that there's multiple futures and that there's multiple visions. And so if we can produce multiple visions, and then if we can create a way to both qualitatively, and I'm not showing you the qualitative analysis here, but also quantitatively analyze that, then we can start to compare and contrast them and stress test them, as we call it. And so we took these scenarios, the connected city, which was focused on so increased mobility and increased ability for social resilience for people to be able to check up on each other, and really thinking about a city that's much more tightly connected in San Juan, not just the old historic core, but the entire set of small towns in and around San Juan, and contrasted that with a scenario that was focused entirely on how do we protect San Juan from coastal flooding. And then we contrasted that with a scenario where the stakeholders sat around the table and said, how do we solve food and energy security in a city on an island? And what might that look like? And you can see in the brown here, this is an urban agriculture area where they said, you know what, in some parts of this, by 2100, we need to get rid of houses and create massive zones for growing food. And then we stress test those, and I know you can't see this, so don't worry about it. I'll just explain it real quick. And said, which one of these is going to do best on coastal flooding? And we could do the same thing to say, which one of these is going to do the best job for cooling the city? And then really be able to compare and contrast, even for scenarios that may not have been focused on coastal flooding, whether or not they might also be successful for dealing with coastal flooding. And what is in the bars here is just looking across different types of land use and land covers and asking the question, which of the scenarios is going to do better on those? And so again, once you bring this qualitative information into a quantitative environment, model out those futures, we have a lot of tools at our disposal to really compare and contrast and see how well these visions might perform, depending on what you want to ask. And we were asking climate questions, but you could ask other things as well. Here's just a couple examples of some of this work in progress. This is at the Manhattan Borough President's Office in Harlem, doing some of this work. This is some of the work in San Juan, Puerto Rico. And then at the end of this, we produced reports that brought back, as I mentioned, we iterate this with the communities and went back and said, okay, does this make sense? We had a subgroup that was formed out of those, and then produced a whole series of reports for all of the different cities we've been working in. And this work is ongoing. So again, we started this in 2015 with some initial funding from the National Science Foundation. The other web link that I put up was for the Convergence Project, the SETS Convergence Project, which is continuing this work in 4 of those cities, in San Juan, Atlanta, Georgia, New York City, and Phoenix, Arizona, where we're continuing to work with those communities long term. This work helped provide direct input. It's, images and outputs from this vision is in the first sustainability plan for Valdivia, Chile that was ever created. It's in the sustainability plan for Phoenix, Arizona. It's informed work in New York City. So we've been finding that this is not just, it's not just an academic exercise. It's not just what we found from the community members as one of the only places they've ever been able to come around the table and talk to someone from the federal government and the city government and their friend who works in another community organization all at the same time, with the same goal of envisioning a more positive future for themselves. But it's also informing local policy and planning. So that's that. The rest of these are all a little bit faster, but I want to bring us into New York City and tell you a little bit about some of how that work is informing some of our co-production work in New York City. And the context here is just to say that New York is a pretty interesting place for thinking about climate impacts. This was just September this year, and I know you've seen images like this in here in Spain, in Germany, and places all around the world. But we've been having our own struggles with the impacts of climate change. And this was a very dramatic event. This broke the record for the most rainfall ever recorded in a single day in 24 hours. This is the tropical storm Ophelia. This is in parts of Brooklyn, Park Slope, Brooklyn. And, I mean, this is like historic, right? We're seeing historic events. But we also saw just 2 years ago another historic event from the aftermath of Hurricane Ida. Here, this broke the record for the most rainfall ever recorded in a single hour. And this storm, the Ida storm, broke the record that was set just a few days earlier from another storm that had broke the record for the most rainfall ever recorded in a single hour. So we're seeing sort of viscerally this impact in a city that has lots of resources, lots of data, lots of motivation around resilience, and yet is really struggling with how do we get to a future that is actually adapted and can learn to live with water, like we mentioned. And this is work we've been trying to do with the city of New York for a long time, which is to say that if we're going to use, even in New York, limited resources to deal with very dramatic and systemic challenges, then we need to think about it in a multi-hazard framework and recognizes that our solutions are going to have to be able to address multiple challenges simultaneously. So we took that work from the UREX project. I mentioned we're working in 4 cities within the SETS Convergence project that's building on that. Here's an example from what we've been doing in New York. We just released a report for this last year in 2022. And this is a series of scenarios that we call the NYC climate adaptation scenarios. And here, the main difference is that the stakeholders are all government officials. So we've decided that we wanted to see what's possible and what city officials could come up with if we gave them the space to feel safe, to be able to talk to each other, get out of their silos within their governance silos, and working across the city agencies, but also state and federal, all that have jurisdiction in New York City. So I don't think we've ever seen anything quite like this, where we had 24 different agencies all in the room together. We did this during the pandemic. We had almost everyone show up for every one of the workshops in a series of online workshops for 5 consecutive weeks. We brought them together and ran through a similar approach with some slight tweaks. So understanding the challenges and articulating goals for the past, present, and future, setting those goals, getting more detailed about the strategies. But one of the things we also heard, and I think this is one of the best outcomes of this whole process, is the middle workshop was focused on transforming governance. And it's just interesting if you think about having a bunch of government officials imagining what a new governance structure might look like. They were so creative. They know the challenges that they have to really get work done because of the nature of silos within the governance structures. And so that was a key part of all of this, is really thinking about what reimagining institutions and the structure of institutions, especially governing institutions, might look like if you want to achieve a New York that can be resilient to the kinds of climate challenges that we will be facing by 2100. And then again, going out long-term, doing backcasting to work backwards, and then reviewing and refining those scenarios. So I'll show you just a couple examples of what came out of that. One, we produced 6 different scenarios. The first one being something that really was new for New York City, which is think about a future that's adapted to multiple hazards simultaneously. It's not just the nature of these city agencies that you have Department of Transportation and Parks and Department of Health all thinking a little bit differently and working somewhat separately, but also they work on hazards separately. So they'll have a heat team and they have a flooding team, right? A coastal flooding team and an extreme precipitation team and a heat team. And that's been the nature of how the Office of Resiliency was first set up. It was set up to think about hazards separately. And so we've slowly been working with them, and they've really trying to think about this in their own, again, governance structure about how to do this in a multi-hazard way. But then we also had folks who are experts on adapting to coastal storms or experts on adapting to heat. And so we developed scenarios for each of those other 5 extremes. And I thought I might just zoom in a little bit, though this is hard to see in the back, and give you an example of what this looks like when we got very detailed about timelines and strategies. So just to point out a couple quick examples. One of them is that by 2100, an overarching goal was embrace the idea that New York City has to learn to live with water, that the seas are going to rise and the rainfall is likely to get more extreme. That's what the projections are telling us. And so what would that look like to really have a city that is able to live with water and adapt it in a resilient way? I'll just give you a very small example. Along the bottom, the different colors correspond to different types of strategies. Here by 2180, a goal that the group came up with across city agencies was that 100% of all pervious surfaces should be impervious, that would be a fundamental infrastructure transformation across the city, that the entire city is made of impervious surface. Maybe in 40, 50 years, we could do that. I mean, it's going to be expensive, right? It's going to take a lot. So then working backwards, what might that look like? Well, it means in 2020, we're going to have to be daylighting streams and starting to tear up concrete and replace with other sources. By 2040, we're going to have policies in place. So from a policy standpoint that are really starting to either legislate or incentivize infrastructure that's pervious and how to do that. And another key piece of this that allows for conveyance. So they were thinking about this simultaneously as not just absorbing water, but safely moving water through the city. That living with water is going to not just be resisting water or absorbing water, but safe conveyance. And then by 2060, knowing that we need a multi-level network of conveyance and detention, right? Places to store water temporarily safely, as well as safe movement of water, which means raising curb heights, turning roads during extreme events into rivers that aren't accidental, that aren't damaging, but actually intentionally designed to move water through the city safely into detention areas, right? And again, working backwards from if we can get there by 2100, what do we have to do by 2060? And again, this is all working with these different working groups to do this. So it's just a little example of this. And then we work with artists to come up with some renditions of what those strategies might look like for heat resilience in this case. Again, lots of green infrastructure. The city's a little obsessed with green infrastructure, which I think is great. But we need to also have a lever of physical resilience strategies and also social resilience strategies, some of which you can see here. Similar for dealing with extreme precipitation and flooding, where we have things like bioswales and rain gardens, but also permeable pavements, buildings that are collecting and storing stormwater, things that the city's done a little bit of, but actually it has to scale up dramatically if it's going to be able to deal with that kind of resilience. And I'm getting a little short on time, but I'm also coming towards the end, so just giving a little warning here. So I know it's a lot of material. The last very brief projects is work that we've been doing on a much more quantitative side to think about those futures, but this is also still co-developed. So this is a project that the city contracted us to do with a number of partners to develop an idea of where is it likely to flood under different extreme precipitation scenarios. And so this was the New York City Stormwater Resiliency Study, again, with government stakeholders, where we worked with some consultants and other partners to develop 1D, 2D coupled H&H models, right? So this is doing the hydrological modeling, running different scenarios to really try to understand where flooding is likely to occur, 4 different types of storm scenarios, and then resulting in an actual map that says under this kind of rainfall event, which is actually very similar to that Ida storm in terms of its intensity, a lot of rain in a single hour, where might it flood? In the blue, you can see it's likely to flood all over the city, but this then allows the city in a quantitative way to say, all right, what police stations or hospitals or education centers might have to actually be moved over the next coming decades because they're just likely to be flooded on a regular basis. So thinking about it in terms of critical infrastructure, where are the vulnerable populations that are going to have more investments because they're vulnerable for lots of reasons. And so how might we prioritize investments for flood resilience based on knowing where the hazard is likely, but also vulnerability, which is the last piece I want to mention about New York. And this resulted in the first ever New York City Stormwater Resiliency Plan that was built on lots of strategies that came out of that work. And that was, again, kind of like the others, many meetings across multiple city agencies, even to define what those scenarios might look like, what critical infrastructures were more important or less important, so that they can think about that in their own strategies that then resulted in this plan. The other piece we've been able to do is to bring this into a visualization environment. and be able to look at some of those both hazard information and vulnerability information in overlays that make it easy, not just for the city to use, but making this publicly available so communities can advocate for themselves and to say, okay, we know we have a challenge and we can zoom in and around that space. So we developed Stormwater NYC for that. And now this work is ongoing. So this is the last New York City project to mention, and I'm just gonna do like 2 minutes on a scale out, which is that the VIA project, as we call it, or VIA project, is now building more climate information. And a key piece of that, just staying with the flooding theme here, is to develop the first ever flood vulnerability index for New York, which sounds like something, at least to me, something pretty basic, that we should have a general idea of where vulnerable populations are to flooding using good methods about index development. This is something Pablo's been working on as part of his PhD work as well. And on the right, you can see a map of this vulnerability index in the city. But what I want to mention is that this is, again, a project where every single month we're working with the interagency climate adaptation task force that brings across multiple city agencies all to sit around and think about how do we prioritize our investments, our emergency response, our operations for different city agencies. And these agencies, you can ignore the names. I just left them in to give you a sense that these are real people. The Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice, the Department of Health, Department of Environmental Protection, Office of Emergency Management, Department of Parks and Recreation, a number of other advisors who are all thinking about if we had, and we'll release this in January to the city in our report. They'll have a new flood vulnerability index. This will be the maps, the set of maps for different types of flood hazards that will guide decision-making for vulnerable populations and equity decisions based on flooding across the city. So some of this core hazard mapping or vulnerability mapping turns out to be fundamental in improving decisions that can focus on vulnerable populations or in a similar way, critical infrastructure. But I put this in because it's also another kind of co-production process. It's a process where we're working very closely in a very regular basis across city agencies to do this work together, which creates your user from the beginning, right? It means that because they helped create it, we have much more confidence that they're going to use it. I wanted to say something about climate IQ, but I feel like I should stop. Do you think 3 more minutes is okay? Mostly for the Aries folks, but I'm not trying to say this isn't for the rest of you, but I thought this might be interesting to you. We've been working with other community organizations, so I could say some more about the work we're doing that's not with the city, but I'm going to keep it simple. So I want to talk about, and again, I'll be brief because I know I've been talking a lot, about a challenge that cities that aren't like New York have. So New York is data rich, New York is resource rich, right? One of the reasons we can not only develop visualizations like this, create lots of overlays, do this kinds of hazard mapping, work with the city, is New York City has access to incredible amounts of data and has been able to fund that themselves and with federal government support and other things. This isn't true for 99.99% of cities all around the world, right? Even within the US, 5,000 cities and towns don't have information like this. Going back to the summary for urban policymakers, one of the key things that we did within the adaptation working group in IPCC was map the adaptation gap. And we know there's a lot of adaptation happening in cities around the world, but we know that especially in the global south, but not only in the global south, most cities have a massive adaptation gap. If you look at what their exposure or likely exposure is to climate hazards, and then you look at their policies or even plans for adaptation, there's just so much need. And one of the core things that they need is information on how to prioritize investments for maximum impact, which brings back to the title of the talk, which is climate risk data. That fundamental, open access, freely available, next generation scientific information about climate risk is the starting point for a lot of cities to do any kind of decision-making, planning, or policy making. So then that's why I mentioned the Aries team, because I'm excited to talk to some of you this afternoon about what you've been doing. We see this challenge as really fundamental. And so we've just launched at Climate Week in New York City in September, a new project we're calling Climate IQ, which is to democratize access to this kind of climate risk information for cities all around the world. It's an ambitious project. It's going to take us multiple years, but the goal is to address this challenge of lack of data and decision support that plagues most adaptation planning, and to do that by building a next generation AI environment that can really harness the massive amounts of data, but not just data, the kinds of model impacts that I showed you, those model outputs from hydrological models and weather forecasting models and urban heat island models, and allow the machine learning environment to learn from all of those to be able to learn about what those climate risk impacts are for types of cities, and then scale that for other cities that are similar in type. And by doing that, we should be able to scale pretty rapidly once we build and validate that environment. And for the technical folks, I'll put up one slide to show you about what it looks like a little bit technically, and then I'll stop. But we want to make sure that it's multi-hazard, so you can think about adaptation planning and policy that's addressing multiple hazards simultaneously. But the goal of this is to identify at-risk communities, help improve emergency response, and especially prioritize investments. And that's really key to unlocking adaptation finance, which is just a small piece of climate finance right now. Right? Most of climate finance is focused on mitigation. How do you unlock that? We really have to shine a light on where those investments can be prioritized for maximum impact. And that's one of the goals. Just a little snapshot of some of the technical workflow. These all kind of expand out and get much more detailed if you want. But basically, the idea is that there's a lot of data that gets fed into the machine and outputs from multiple types of models that get fed into the machine. And it learns patterns from that, patterns for different types of cities, old cities, new cities, compact cities, sprawling cities, desert cities, tropical cities, temperate cities. And we feed that in, develop, and then provide that information in a dashboard that's actually simple and easy to use. And so we're going to learn, hopefully, from some of the work that we've been doing, providing and building some of these decision support tools over the past few years to build that as well. So there's a lot of partners involved, but the goal here is not just maps, but a way that cities can really kind of dial in and unpack a lot of that information and use that to drive decision support. So I'm going to stop there and say that our hope is that with that project, we're going to be able to do something like we did with New York, which is provide core heat hazard information back in 2018 for their $100 million plan to address heat challenges in the city. And for the city of Phoenix to inform their climate action plan, but that we can do that for not just hundreds, but thousands of cities, providing that core information. Because that work is slow. We've been doing this work. I've mentioned most of the cities we've done this in. It's important. That local stakeholder co-development process is important, but we also have to find ways to scale to address the urgency of the challenge that we started with. And so we're hoping that Climate IQ can be one of those tools to do that. So thanks very much. Appreciate your stuff. Cool. I know that was a lot, but I hopefully give you a sense of a little bit of the work that we're doing.
Yeah, the floor is open if anybody's asking any questions.
Yeah, I have many questions, but I was wondering how all the work that you do in the Urban Systems Lab integrates with all the policy development in New York City. So as far as I know, there is like one New York City resilience plan. Maybe this is the old plan, or they have a new plan, and how all the work that you are doing is integrated in all that the government is leading, or if you are like in contact relationship with them and you are hired to do these specific pieces of modeling, how does it work?
In many ways. So the projects that I mentioned, the VIA project, the Stormwater Resiliency Study, those are contracts. So it's kind of like consulting, except we approach it differently because as academics, they just naturally approach it differently. But so some of it is contracting and providing information, and then they do with it what they want, right? We've been trying to be careful about that so that we see real impact out of that work. And I think that's been true for both of those projects. The other is maintaining relationships. So as you know, there's turnover with administrations, not just at the top, but all the way through agencies. And so sometimes that's very challenging because someone I might personally have had a relationship with for 8 years now got poached by the private sector and is gone. And there's a new person in their place. And so we try to be very quick about following up, in some cases being a source of institutional memory. Like, this is what we were just working on for the last 2 years. Let's maintain that relationship. And so we've done that pretty well with the administration change that happened 2 years ago. But specific to plans and policies, some of that work, like the NYC Cool Neighborhoods plan that was launched in 2018, as part of developing that plan, this was Mayor Bloomberg. Mayor Bloomberg launched the Urban Heat Island Task Force. And so I was part of that task force, other people part of that task force, and that task force was tasked with coming up with the core structure of the plan. So then the city used that as a process, developed the plan, and as part of that process, they brought in academics and researchers, in addition to researchers that are in the Department of Health and researchers that were in the Department of Parks and some of their decision makers, which meant that we had sort of political access to that. So that's another way that it works. But some of this is just about building trust. And 10 years ago, we didn't have that level of access. And so we weren't as impactful. And so it's also been maintaining that.
I can add, there's the MPCC. I think it's a really big part of that relationship now with academics, with researchers, and the city.
Yeah, so that's a good point. So there's a culture of working with academic institutions, and there's sort of two big pieces. One is the New York City Panel on Climate Change, with Mayor Bloomberg, started a long time ago at the beginning of his administration. But it wasn't just the mayor started, because right, a new mayor comes in, they get rid of it, right? You can't, because it's legislated, it's required by law that the New York City Panel on Climate Change exists, and that the city take every climate policy that it makes, it takes in NPCC recommendations and information into account. So it becomes the scientific resource for all climate policy and planning. And that now is not just legislated, it's a culture. That's what they look to. And so being part of the NPCC is really important. Having that body exist is really important. The other piece, which comes out of both of these contracts I mentioned, is the city, about 10 years ago, it's also under Bloomberg, turns out, developed what it's called a town and gown. It's just a name, but it means the city and academia, and that they would funnel a percentage of contracts that normally go to consultants into academia as the rhetoric is to support education. But the idea is that you support education by supporting research. And so it's a small percentage. Arcadis and Arup and the big ones, they still get most of the contracts, but a portion of that goes to academia. And so the two projects I mentioned were both bids that were put out for academics to bid on, as opposed to consultants. And again, that's something that the city does that not a lot of cities do.
Yeah, in fact, yeah, I was thinking when you mentioned the data reach and the data availability in New York City, I was thinking on the other side that you have a long legacy of collaboration, scientific and policy collaboration. And yeah, I'm very jealous.
Yeah, well, me too, because I work in other cities as well, and it's not as easy.
Yeah.
And really seeing where that impact might be is it's a long-term plan to figure out how to be impactful in other places. Exactly. Yeah.
Mark?
Yeah, picking up on what Martin said, I'm very jealous. I think that must be really exciting being in it's like considered, one of the best practice cities that started these processes very early on. The integration of academia from the beginning. I had two quite specific questions. I was wondering how they were dealt with in New York City. One is I was recently at a conference on climate change and health, and somebody mentioned that coming from a health perspective, from the city of Barcelona, that from their perspective, the main issue was draining the water as quickly as possible from the city. And it sounded to me nearly like a 19th century civil engineering perspective. And the rationale was that with more flooding, with having more nature-based solutions, with increased warming, there's going to be an increase of mosquitoes and vector-borne diseases going with this. You see this in Europe already, new diseases or old diseases coming back in. So this could maybe even be like an unintended consequence, like if you're focusing on heat wave, flooding, drought, but this would be like an effect maybe cascading further down the chain that might have not been initially considered. I was wondering how that's considered. And the second one related to sea level rise. We often have this horizon where we end at 2100, and we see these curves of sea level rise going up, still the gradient still increasing. And so the question is, what is how is that considered also, including the uncertainty around sea level rise? You know, if it's considering 1 meter or multiple meters of sea level rise. So I just wondered how on these two things New York City is currently moving, or how they are considered.
Yeah, well, for the first one, there's not a lot of discussion on vector-borne diseases as trade-offs of investing in green infrastructure or nature-based approaches. It just isn't that well discussed. It's not because there's no one working on vector-borne risk or other things. There's a number of researchers doing that, but it hasn't been a major issue. And it may be because we haven't had a major unintended consequence that has like brought that to the level of decision making, that I think it's just been very low level as a potential risk. So it's a really good point, because it's with variable rainfall as the projection, some extreme, some dry, some in the middle. It's kind of hard to know what rainfall is going to do. It could very well be that we have other mosquito-borne or vector-borne diseases that we've already faced. I mean, Zika was a challenge in the city, and other. It's not just mosquitoes, right? There's many types of vectors that the city has to pay attention to. But it hasn't come up as a major trade-off in terms of adaptation strategies. And I think that probably is a legacy of not having to worry about it too much. But that may change. On the sea level rise, that is a huge topic of how to deal with uncertainty in the projection models and how far out you go. And right now, what's happening in the city is that the city is pushing very hard for conservative numbers to come out of the New York City panel on climate change, because they don't want to set benchmarks that are below what might happen in some extreme event. So Hurricane Sandy, which happened in 2012, was sort of the event of record that really changed resilience and adaptation strategies in New York. And the information we had at the time under projected the potential impacts of a storm like that. So they really want the scientific body to use sort of high emission scenarios to set design guidelines for resilience adaptations that move forward within the development community. What I mean is, ultimately how this all gets translated is there's a number, and the engineers or the designers are still going to build to, this is the potential height of flooding in this neighborhood. And they want that number to be one that is using high emission scenarios. But they also know there's a lot of uncertainty. So we've been giving them, and again, this is coming out of NPCC, and so the next assessment report will probably come out during Earth Week in April, but the interim report with the new climate projections is in final peer review right now. It should probably come out in January. And what will come out of those, because we've already provided the initial results to the city, is 10th, 50th, and 90th percentile of those climate projections. And they want to use the 90th percentile. So they're asking for that. So that's been kind of interesting to realize that the city wants the high numbers, because one, we've had an experience that without high numbers, things aren't adapted well in terms of what gets built, but also because they want to make sure that they're giving, I'm using the word conservative, but a conservative set of numbers to the design and development community, because that community will have to respond to what the city requires. Some of it's legal, some of it's recommended, right? But the city also has something called the Climate Resilient Design Guidelines, or the CRDGs. This is something that started and is iterated every year. And so as the New York City Panel climate change projection numbers get updated, then the resilient design guidelines get updated. And they have this line of sight in those meetings constantly. What is the numbers that go into the design guidelines? And how do we make sure that we know there's uncertainty, but we're using this upper level as our benchmark? And I think that's to the city's credit that they're thinking that way.
They're continuously changing as well.
They are continuously changing, and one of the things that came out of the CMIP6 scenarios for New York City is the downscaled CMIP6 scenarios for New York actually have decreased some of that uncertainty and decreased the upper range. And the city was very concerned about that, because the last sea level rise projections were a little higher than the new ones. And so they were like, wait a minute, what's going on here? I'm like, well, the science is changing. It's getting a little more accurate. There's still a lot of uncertainty, but it has decreased a little bit for this part of the North Atlantic. Yeah, it's an interesting problem. How do you deal with the uncertainty when you're trying to set guidelines for construction or for engineering?
Thank you for the presentation. I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit on the process of the visioning exercises that you conducted. Did you note any differences in creativity of the different stakeholder groups, like youth groups, or because you talked a lot about the tyranny of present. I have a feeling that there's a tyranny of lack of imagination as well. So that's one question. Following up, were there any really radical imaginaries or utopias? Like, did they ever, for example, think about a non-two-party governance system for the US, or was there room for that to elaborate on real transformative scenarios?
Let's take the last part first. Definitely, there was a lot of really wild ideas because we were trying to encourage them. We're like, if we're going to actually adapt to the kinds of, let's say, end of century, 90th percentile, high emission scenarios, then our cities are probably going to have to think way beyond what they're thinking about now. And that includes in governance, in the political realm, in the economic realm. We had lots of folks coming in, you know, who are thinking about degrowth strategies, but how do you couple that with the need for lots of infrastructure development and other things that's going to require a robust economy? And so you have people butting heads around those. Definitely things that we're thinking about politics in terms of the need for different political, a completely different political climate. And I don't just mean who's in power, but the nature of how that process works. However, that part, because it tends to be federal, even though of course there's state and city levels, because the dominant paradigm is sort of from the federal all the way down, we tend to sidestep that by thinking about this city in this region, as opposed to how do we solve the national crisis simultaneously. But those issues definitely came up. I also think because of that, I would suggest that there wasn't a lack of creativity. There was a time, it was a bit time bound, meaning that it didn't happen right away. We really had to help people get out of, yeah, but what's going to happen in 2 years and with the next administration, and will we get them to do this one policy that I've been working on for 5 years, and that's the one thing I think needs to change. Or, you know, my community is just concerned with food security. Until we solve that in an immediate present, I can't think about the housing crisis or whatever. Or it was the housing crisis. Until we solve the housing crisis, I can't think about climate resilience. So we had that really strongly in Harlem, for example, where they really wanted to talk about housing and job security. And then they started thinking about energy security and microgrids. And then we eventually got them to start thinking about flood resilience and heat resilience and those strategies. But it didn't happen in the first hours. They really keep coming back and like, but it's 2100. You don't have to solve all the problems today. When you think about 2100, you will have to solve those, but you don't have to solve them immediately. Let's get creative and imagine the future, and then we'll work backwards to that. So that was just one of the, I think, ongoing challenges we've had, including with city government stakeholders, which is to develop the space and facilitate a space where they could think long-term, because we're so well trained to not think long-term. And yet we need long-term planning. So I think that was definitely a learning that came out of it. It's an ongoing challenge to really create space and facilitate a process where people can actually start to think about long-term solutions and what that might mean to start putting them in place. I think we all just kind of struggle with that.
Hi, thank you. It's really, really nice. I'm just wondering on the differences between using these approaches in developing versus developed contexts beyond data, which of course that's one main issue, but technical capacity, this governance systems, financial issues. So what was your experience? I mean, you mentioned San Juan, I think, and New York City. So what's your experience in both contexts? Does the framework still is the framework still useful in both contexts, or did you have to adjust in some cases? You will just take away all differences or challenges that you might find in that.
Yeah, good question. Thank you. Generally, the framework overall continues to work well in very different kinds of locations, and not just in the US and Latin American contexts. So I didn't mention this because I'm not directly involved in this, but my colleagues at Georgia State University, Arizona State University, particularly my colleague David Waniak at Georgia State, he does work in Malawi and other African contexts, and he's done some work like this in some Asian contexts. And we still use the same framework. What I mean is this framework of getting the big challenges on the table so we can all kind of talk them out and agree on them, articulating some large scale goals that have different characteristics. And one of them wasn't that everything has to be transformative. We sort of had this hierarchy, and I didn't show you the slide for this today, but of what we might call incremental change, which tends to dominate people's ideas about what needs to change. Then adaptive strategies, which may not be that transformative, but are a key piece. And then the ones that really seem like they're out there, but if you think long term, are probably going to be required, which are the transformative strategies. And that, along with the overall process, has worked really well in all the contexts. But there's never been a workshop that was the same as another workshop. I mean, people bring their own ideas. How much they really invest in the timelining or mapping activities is different. We find that everyone enjoys if you can create the space for the even more creative moments, which is these actor narratives that we try to build time in, where people will do something that we call a day in the life, where you create a character, this imaginary character. They live in this future. They walk around. What's their normal life like? What is it like to get up, go to work, go to school? And everyone really loved those because it engages another kind of creative thinking about what a future might look like once you've figured it out. The challenge that I have seen in all of them is that there's never enough time. So on the one hand, no one wants to commit a whole day or multiple days, or the city didn't want to commit 3-hour workshops. Can we do it in an hour? And 5, can we do 3? But then once they're in it, everyone wants more time, because once they get involved in the process. And so in every case, people have said, oh, I wish we could keep doing this. I wish it's longer. And another sort of consistent theme was we've never been able to have this kind of convening and talk to each other in this way, right? We've had people who, in the case of Miami, Florida, there was some examples of 2 different community organizations who know about each other, have been working on similar kinds of issues for a decade and have never met in person, right? This is pre-pandemic, right? Never met in person. Like, this is the first time, and it took you guys to come in and like help us actually sit down around a table and imagine what we could do together, than separately. And it sounds like a lot of patting ourselves on the back. I don't actually mean it that way. It's just that these are rare opportunities for people to imagine together. And I think we've just found that it's extremely rewarding, but they're always different. And how the architecture of them works is different, but the main, let's call them activities that we do, there's a set of activities and they're all somewhat similar. But I didn't explain all of them either, so there's a lot of other pieces.
This is the last question probably. It's going to be technical. Like, this is concerning the climate IQ which you have shown. So I'm a bit concerned about the resolution, scalability, and the global applicability. Like you've been mentioning that you have like selected like 170 cities, or there was a number, rectifying it if I'm wrong. So my question would be that what are the parameters that have decided to develop the typology of the cities? Because when we are talking about different hazards and different urban risks, so there's a geographical features, population, the typology of the built infrastructure. So like if you are selecting like a particular set of cities from Asia or from Africa or from the Northern Europe, so but the geographical features and other, there will be always conflicting with each other. So I'm just curious to know that how accurate the replicability is going to be to the cities where there is like a data scarce situation, where you don't have it. This kind of applications are going to be super useful to identify the at-risk communities, but I'm just concerned about the level of accuracy that will be taken into consideration, and also how you're going to look at the parameters for defining the type of cities.
Yeah, excellent questions. Something we've been giving a lot of thought to, and we haven't solved all the way. So I'll just put that right out in front. That this is a work in progress. We're still working on it. But those aspects that you mentioned in terms of the built environment and built infrastructure, right? You can think of compact, tall cities,
Yes.
ones that are very flat and short, right? The nature of the atmospheric modeling is the modeling can be the same, but how important it is different, right? Taller buildings really have such a strong effect on, say, air movement and air currents and how that impacts actual heat exposure on the ground. They provide shades, in other cities, you just have almost no shade features because they're so flat. So the climatological context is a key variable. The built infrastructure context, so the sort of concentration of roads and buildings, building heights is one of the big pieces we're working on right now. What is the best building height information there is? If you want to route hydrological models through the city, you need building footprints. So Google just released a building footprint data, 3 weeks ago. It's got issues, of course it does. OSM has all these gaps, and in some places just totally wrong. The Microsoft building footprint data that came out a couple years ago, we've been working with for years, and by working with, I mean trying to make it work, and it just has so many problems. So there's some fundamental data inputs that are challenging. That doesn't mean we can't use municipal data to train models, though, and to help them learn about urban types. So there's also the ability to use data that aren't global scale data sets, because the idea is to be global first, but that doesn't mean we have to train the model on all global data. We do have to train a model that can take similar data inputs. So even if we train it on, say, municipal sources of data, we could feed it global data sets as the global data becomes better. So that's one way of iterating this approach, is that we'll train with high resolution, high accuracy data, keeping a line of sight that to scale, we're going to have to use less accurate, most likely less accurate data. For the hazard modeling, the goal is to be relatively high resolution, and by that we mean 10 meter to 30 meter, not at the kilometer scale. The other thing we'll be keeping an eye on is that at least long-term projection models coming out of what will be CMIP7, there are goals to release CMIP7, my understanding of this, at much higher resolution than before, and there's lots of other downscaling techniques that are out there already. So, we're keeping an eye on some of those, just in terms of what some of the projection pieces that would feed into the model that then would distribute that higher resolution based on the built infrastructure data that exists, land use data, land cover data, road data, buildings data. Those are all parts of the data inputs for the modeling. So the resolution we want to be able not to just prioritize general areas, but to prioritize at sort of, think of it as a neighborhood scale of where you might really try to focus adaptation strategies at that level. That's what we're hearing is needed, not big regional projections that say it's going to increase roughly this amount, but you don't really know where it's going to be hottest in the city or where you're likely to have the most flood in the city. There's a lot more to say on this technically though, so I'm happy to talk some more.
I think we will be joining.
Yes.
Okay, so we have time to talk. Okay, great.
It's a great way to.
Yeah, quiz me and
To wrap
I'll
up.
quiz you and we'll see what becomes. Yeah.
But also, for the better or the worse, Taiwan is enough is one. We're not gonna go for lunch. Then from 3 to 4, we're gonna have a meeting. But probably like from 4 to 5, unless you're busy, you're probably gonna
I'm here to
hopefully
talk.
be bothered by as many people as
Okay,
possible.
great.
Do feel free to not. And he's leaving tomorrow, but Maria and I are in close contact. So if anything you want to expand on, let us know. Definitely work on connection. Thank you so much.
Great.
Thank you so much.